Hi, thank you for joining us on Listen Up Homebuyers. My name is Victoria Ray Henderson, and I am so happy to have Peggy Bailey with us today. She is the Vice President for Housing and Income Security at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Her work protects and expands access to affordable housing, improves states' temporary assistance for needy families, and focuses on child support programs and expands employment opportunities to housing and cash assistance recipients. Before joining the center, Peggy served in the Biden-Harris administration as the senior advisor on rental assistance to HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge. Peggy, thank you so much for taking time out of your very important work to talk to us here on Listen Up Homebuyers.
Thanks, Victoria, for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad because there's so much to cover. And I wanted to start with the fact that you recently testified at the Senate, in front of the Senate Budget Committee, talking about the affordable housing crisis. And you said some things that were so simple, but I felt that they were really profound, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to say them again.
Great. Well, no, thank you. And I testifying before the Senate Banking Committee is always an interesting experience. But you're right that is exactly what I was trying to do, was convey some really simple points. Point number one being that the reason that there is no housing affordability crisis is because people simply don't have the money to be able to afford to pay their rent. The industry standard is that housing is affordable if the residents are paying about 30% of their income toward rent. That means, and then they have 70% of their income to pay for all the other things that families need. But too many families are paying 40, 50, more than 50% of their income on rent, and it's not their fault. They're
Right.
working hard and they simply don't make enough money to afford what basic rent costs are.
Yeah.
Because the other piece of that to remember is that landlords have to charge a certain amount of money to be able to pay their mortgage, pay their taxes, operate and properly maintain the building. And so
Mhm.
even if landlords only charged enough for those basic pieces, minimum rent would still be out of reach for too many people.
Too many people, too many people. And so this is obviously a multifaceted issue and problem. Where do you start? I
Well,
mean,
I think it's important to understand that the housing market is doing exactly as we would expect the market to react. We know that actually multifamily housing is being developed at a pretty good clip. But most of that housing is at the upper end of the market. So the first step is for the government to do what it does and use tools like the low income housing tax credit to make more multi to create the opportunity for more multifamily housing to
mhm,
be lower cost,
mhm,
and affordable for those folks that are in the middle, that have middle incomes. And
yeah,
then the other piece then is for the government to help subsidize the income of the folks that don't have enough money to afford rent.
mm,
And they would then use those resources in those properties that have been created with the low income housing tax credit and other federal resources that help bring down the cost of housing development overall and make those units more affordable.
Are there any places that you can give us examples where they're doing this right, whether it's another country or someplace in the United States?
I think there are pockets of innovation. We are doing a lot of learning from European countries that are taking more of a social approach to housing and making sure that everyone can afford a place to live.
Mhm.
In the United States, we want to make sure that not only is a building itself affordable, but people can take that affordability and move,
Mhm.
whether it's
Mhm.
in their same community to another state. And so adding that component to is critically important as I see it. I
Yeah.
think at building housing is one thing, making housing universally affordable with the flexibility that people need to be able to live wherever they choose is
Mhm.
another important component, especially in the United States.
Yeah. And a huge part of that is childcare. because the minute that isn't included, the costs of childcare they're crippling. They're crippling for middle income families, low income families.
That's an excellent point, Victoria, because we used to or usually talk about housing as a family's most expensive expense.
Right.
However, childcare competes with that and sometimes is actually more expensive than their housing costs.
Mhm.
And if you think about folks who are working with children,
Mhm.
childcare is a critical component of how many hours parents can work in order to be able to have the income they need to afford housing or any of their other basic needs. That
Right.
what we're talking about is families not having enough money to afford their basic needs.
Mhm.
So thinking about, how then does housing assistance and just general cash support kind of fit together to
Mhm.
make sure that families have the flexibility, regardless of what
Right.
their needs are,
Right.
to be able to pay for those things.
Right.
And so, because we need to make sure that families have enough money to be able to pay for childcare, to be able to pay for diapers, to be able to pay for food, whatever that family needs, in addition to their housing, we need to be able to create some minimum support for that.
Yeah. And you made a really good point before we started the podcast when you said this is about housing justice and everyone has a right to housing.
Absolutely. So for too long, we've treated housing as purely a commodity, as
Mhm.
purely something that there are just people who deserve housing and folks who don't.
Mhm.
And that is, to say it's unjust is an understatement.
Mhm.
Housing, along with food and healthcare, is a basic need that everyone should have access to.
Mhm.
And as I said, the main reason folks don't is because they don't have enough money to be able to afford minimum rent.
Mhm.
And understanding that gets away from having to solve a problem that a
Mhm.
family might be facing.
Mhm.
Maybe the parents have a mental health disorder. Maybe there's been a recent injury and the parents can't work as much as they were before.
Mhm.
And so we focus in on those things rather
Mhm.
than focusing in on how about we just give people enough money to be able to afford to pay the rent.
Yeah.
And along with that, we do need to think about things like rent mitigation and rent cost containment so that we're controlling rent costs,
Mhm.
and understanding that rents have for too long been increasing at a rate higher than inflation.
Yeah.
What do we all deserve?
Yeah.
Housing has to be one of those things along with food and
Yeah.
healthcare.
You had mentioned also about leveling the playing field. There's obviously racial injustice involved, and but are there any programs that you can say that are doing this right now that we?
Sure, absolutely. The first thing in understanding how to solve a problem is identifying the correct problem.
Mhm.
And part of that is understanding the racism and discrimination that underlines most of the things, if not all of the things that we've used in the past for solutions.
Right.
And so what can we do to really dismantle the systems and programs and redesign them in ways that correct for past racism and discrimination? One
Mhm.
of the things is simply giving families cash, right? And so there are several pilot projects around the country
Mhm.
that we generally call guaranteed basic income programs that are looking at folks with the most need and targeting cash assistance to those to them
Yeah.
and then showing how giving someone cash helps stabilize them in housing and
Mm.
helps improve their nutrition and helps people work.
Right.
Uh, and one of the places that's doing this is Denver.
Mhm.
Denver has a guaranteed basic income pilot that's targeted to people who are unhoused. They've been doing this for about a year. They just have gotten funding from a variety of sources, including the city itself, to
Mhm.
extend this pilot project.
Mhm.
And the results are really promising. And it just shows that for too long,
Yeah.
we've let racism and paternalism dictate
Mhm.
programs to a degree that make them impossible for people to
Right.
get access to, expensive to administer, and
Right.
simplifying things by just giving people the cash that they need
Right.
actually sounds like common sense, but it's something we haven't been doing for way too long.
Yeah. Just recently, President Biden called on Congress to invest $175 billion in affordable housing initiatives. Whether or not it gets through Congress, we'll see how that goes. What are your thoughts?
Sure. A big part of the president's proposal would go to increasing affordable housing supply and making it just easier to be able to build affordable housing and incentivize developers to act in this space and increase the number of units that are available. There's one proposal that's just simply to create a grant program so that it reduces the number of funding resources housing developers need to put together to build housing. But people don't always understand how expensive it actually is to build affordable housing, which seems counterintuitive.
Right.
It's because there's no one single resource that developers can go to build housing. They have to put together what we call a capital stack, a stack of financing to build affordable housing. And a lot of that requires time and energy and local meetings and things like that, that all add cost to developing the building. So a lot of the president's proposal is in that vein of how can we make it just easier and streamline the process of financing affordable housing. Oh, the president does also include some rental assistance subsidies in that proposal. We would say that we need more to be able to fully meet the 22 million people who are struggling to afford, are struggling to afford housing and paying way too much of their income on rent. But it does include some first steps along those lines.
Yeah, good. So I'm imagining that this proposal also includes cutting out a lot of the red tape that's involved. Does it help streamline the process a little bit as well?
It does, not necessarily with money, with the president being able to use his bully pulpit to explain to localities and states the importance of thinking about zoning and allowing for more density and things like, and reducing the number of community meetings and streamlining the process for approval processes. A lot of that red tape is actually at the state and really at the local level. And so the federal government doesn't necessarily can act, but they can strongly suggest and explain the value of.
Peggy, getting back to the basic right that everyone does have a right to housing and housing justice, can you talk a little bit more about what kind of rental assistance programs are going to be available to people who need the help now?
Absolutely. So one of the really cool things about 2024 is it's the 50th anniversary of the Housing Choice Voucher Program. During the course of the year, you'll get to see ways that HUD and the Center on Budget and a lot of our national partners are going to highlight this. And one of the lost things in the beginnings of the Housing Choice Voucher Program is that it was created as direct assistance to tenants. So rather than how we do it now, where the landlord has a lot of say and a lot of control and even can decide whether to accept or not accept a housing voucher, it was given directly to tenants. So that's something that HUD has even said that they're interested in going back to thinking about how we might create a program like that. Overall, we really need to think about how we've been increasing access to rental assistance in the last 10, 20, 30 years. We've done it in a way that reinforces deservingness, while of course, and we've created subpopulations, and each time we've created a subpopulation that's eligible, we've created a separate program. So we have the Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing Program. We have a foster youth voucher program. We have a voucher program for people with disabilities. What we need to do is take a step back and realize that all people with low incomes need voucher assistance. And so not to take away assistance from any of those populations, but connect the dots so that no one falls through the cracks and start increasing access to rental assistance, starting with people with the lowest incomes and going up, so that we're not reinforcing the deserving status, and we're closing any gaps in affordability, because after a while you just start to run out of subpopulations to be able to narrowly fit people into. And instead, we really need to get housing assistance to everyone who needs it.
Yeah, that makes sense, because then there would be people who could fall through the cracks in some of those instances. And are you saying that then there wouldn't be a housing voucher, which I know, there's been a lot of discrimination against having a housing voucher. So that wouldn't be that. It would be direct money that they could then use. So that, again, the playing field would be leveled for that person.
Yeah, it might still be a voucher in nature, or at least, assistance that's specifically for rent. But
Mhm.
instead of the landlord having the control and being able to say whether or not they're going to accept assistance, whether or not they're going to participate in the program, the assistance would be given to the person, similar to how we do food assistance,
Mhm.
so that the person has autonomy and choice, and we
Right,
figure out ways to make that assistance more invisible to landlords,
right.
with the hope of reducing some of the discrimination that we know happens within the program.
Right. So much of this is about empowering the individual. Not
Exactly. Think about the peace of mind that anyone has when they go home at night and are able to
Mhm.
lock the door, and they're
Right.
not having to worry about an eviction notice,
Yeah.
becoming homeless, or having to make really difficult choices about what you're going to do with the limited
Mhm.
resources that you have.
Yeah.
Having a home and that stability is life-changing for people.
Peggy Bailey is the Vice President for Housing and Income Security at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Her work has been protecting and expanding access to affordable housing, improving the state's temporary assistance for needy families, with a focus on child support programs and expanding employment opportunities. Peggy, it is such a pleasure to have you on Listen Up Homebuyers. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.